Well, it's that time for the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, August the 7th. My name is Pam, and let's just begin with our first article. The Ultimate High Ground, Russia and U.S. Try to Set Rules for Space Weapons by Fred Weir in Moscow. Russian and U.S. negotiators met in Vienna last week to discuss a danger that has become increasingly urgent in recent years: how to curb the militarization of space. Unless a new treaty or at least a general understanding is soon established, experts say the future of human activity on the final frontier is going to look more like Star Wars than Star Trek. There's a lot to talk about. Last week, the newly minted U.S. Space Force accused Russia of developing a projectile weapon in the near Earth orbit close to a U.S. spy satellite. Though nothing was destroyed, the United States has been complaining for over a year about Russia's use of a maneuverable new breed of inspector satellites that can spy on U.S. satellites and might be employed as weapons. The Russians, for their part, argue that the U.S. has developed elaborate Earth-based weaponry capable of attacking an adversary satellite network in war. Both sides clearly agree that it's high time to sit down and at least begin a conversation about it. If this process of weaponizing space gets going, it can lead to a hugely expensive and destabilizing arms race, says Vladimir Dvorkin, an expert with the Center for International Security at IMEMO, which is a major Russian research institution under the Russian Academy of Sciences. Right now, there are no laws against the development of conventional weapons in Earth orbit, either the kind that can hit other objects in space or the kind that can hit the Earth. We really need to sit down and come to an agreement. Satellite strategy. The only major international treaty that regulates the militarization of space, the Outer Space Treaty, was signed at the dawn of the space age in 1967. It bans the stationing of weapons of mass destruction in Earth orbit, but does nothing to limit the multitude of military and dual-purpose technologies that have since proliferated or are under active development. They include spy satellites, electronic warfare platforms, global positioning and targeting systems, missile interceptors, and laser weapons. The U.S. accuses Russia of fielding a new type of vehicle, which is able to scoot around under its own power, spying on other satellites and potentially destroying them. Specifically, the discussion is about Cosmos 2543, which was launched from a larger Russian satellite, Cosmos 2542, in December of 2019. The Russians insist that the new vehicle, which has snuggled up to both Russian and U.S. satellites since appearing, is just an inspector satellite whose job is basic reconnaissance. But earlier this month, Cosmos 2543 itself disgorged a new object from its body that the U.S. Space Force judged to be some sort of projectile weapon which, firing under its own tiny engine power, could easily be used to destroy another satellite. This is further evidence of Russia's continuing efforts to develop and test space-based systems, said General John Raymond, U.S. Space Force Chief of Space Operations, in an official statement, and consistent with the Kremlin's published military doctrine to employ weapons that hold U.S. and allied space assets at risk. The Russians say it's just a probe intended to help the inspection work of the larger vehicle. But it's a whole new situation, and it raises a host of questions, says Andrei Belitsky, a security expert at MGIMO, the Moscow State Institution of International Relations. This issue is pretty fuzzy, he says. Once you have something in space that can maneuver with its own engine power, you effectively have a weapon. It doesn't take much to knock out a satellite. But, of course, for it to be an actual warfighting threat, you would need to have an awful lot of them already positioned in Earth orbit, not just one. The Russian satellite killer test, if it was that, was far from unprecedented. During the Cold War, both the US and the Soviet Union experimented with ways to destroy enemy space infrastructure, sometimes involving nuclear weapons. After signing the Outer Space Treaty, efforts switched to more targeted methods. In 1985, the US successfully destroyed an American target satellite using an anti-satellite, or an ASAT, missile fired from a high-flying F-15 fighter. In 2008, the US employed a sea-based Aegis missile defense weapon to shoot down a huge US reconnaissance satellite with hazardous fuel compounds on board, in an operation billed as intended to ensure public safety, but criticized for its military implications. A year earlier, China destroyed one of its own satellites using an ASAT missile, an operation that left large amounts of hazardous debris floating in orbit. India conducted a similar test last year. The rise of Space Force. Russian analysts say that Moscow is deeply worried about the secretive US military program in space, which now has an official face in the form of the US Space Force, a new branch of the US military. Among its missions is the operation of the mysterious X-37B, an unmanned version of the old space shuttle. The two ships in the U.S. squadron have already had 5 secret space flights, logging a total of nearly 8 years in orbit. The Russians claim that the X-37B does much the same tasks that their Cosmos satellites do, including positioning maneuverable inspector satellites in Earth orbit. The Space Force is reportedly due to reveal an official doctrine for fighting war in space in the next month, something that Russian analysts warn might lead inexorably into new space arm race. Russia's concern isn't so much about any particular U.S. weapon or activity in space at present, says Mr. Belitsky, but we do worry that now there is a permanent U.S. Space Force, and it is producing its own warfighting doctrine, that we could have an unstoppable process. This renders any effort to find strategic stability on Earth much more complicated. At the same time, some Russian analysts fret about the collapse of the U.S.-Russian space cooperation, whose heyday was in Cold War times, but which continued until recently in connection with the International Space Station. But Russia has declined to join NASA's Artemis program, which plans to put people back on the moon by 2024. Recently, the Russian space agency Roscosmos reacted angrily to President Donald Trump's April order to allow mining on the moon, even in the absence of any international treaty to regulate it. Russia has since announced that it will partner with China to build a research station on the moon, a move that will do little to resolve earthly tensions. Whatever else happened, space cooperation was always a shining light, evidence that countries could cooperate for the common good, says Andrei Ionin, an independent Russian expert. Such projects always played a stabilizing role, but now it seems everyone will go their separate ways when it comes to exploring the moon. Every man for himself is hardly the way to improve international cooperation. This next article, Digging Up Forgotten Kingdoms, Saudi Unearths Ancient Identity, by Taylor Luck. Al-Ula, Saudi Arabia. Tarek never knew his daily commute was in the footsteps of ancient Arab kings. The 30-year-old Al-Ula resident runs his hands over the exposed brick and rock inscriptions he has known since a child as the ruins. Listening as a tour guide lists the achievements of the tribes that built a kingdom on these sands 3,000 years ago. Squinting at the rock-carved tombs in front of him, he sees something greater than a civilization, a connection. They prayed, they grew dates, they performed pilgrimages, and welcomed visitors to the oasis like we do today. Tarek says as he stops to pose for a selfie in front of a rock engraving. They lived just like us. Today, Saudi authorities and archaeologists are unearthing and promoting Dedan and Leon, 2 Arab kingdoms whose traces have lain under sand and obscurity for centuries. Cited in the Old Testament and ancient Greek texts, the ancient kingdoms once ruled vital trade routes. Saudi citizens are pointing to the kingdoms as proof not only that this arid region was home to civilizations centuries before the modern oil boom, but that the people of Saudi Arabia are the latest in a proud lineage stretching back millennia, that there is more to being a Saudi than oil and religion. Missing piece of ancient map: Mesopotamia, Pharaonic Egypt, Phoenicia, Persia. These names of Middle Eastern civilizations have echoed through the centuries, capturing humanity's imagination, recalling greatness and inspiring art, literature, films, and entire fields of study. Yet while most of the Middle East and Mediterranean were rich in legendary city-states, the vast Arabian deserts were, for generations of archaeologists and academics, flyover country of little note or historic value, a blank spot on the map of the ancient world. If they were so great, where are the monuments? Where are the cities? The cities, it turns out, are still being unearthed, and what has already been uncovered of Dedan and Liyan in the deserts of northwestern Saudi Arabia has turned conventional wisdom on its head. Here, in Al-Ula, the remnants of these sprawling desert kingdoms from the first millennium BC are woven into the landscape. Temple columns, 1 meter thick brick walls, rock-carved tombs, detailed statues, and inscriptions scrawled borders poke out among date farms, houses, and newly established eco-resorts. Most of what scholars know today of these kingdoms is from the hundreds of rock inscriptions scrawled across the area in the Dadanite language, a Semitic offshoot telling of kings and pilgrims, migrant communities, and daily life and death, and taxes. On a Saturday in March, Thuraya and Al-Ula resident guides visitors through Jabal al-Iqam, one of Al-Ula's craggy gorges scrawled with hundreds of pristine Dadanite, Lahiyanite, and early Arabic inscriptions. This is their library, a collection of their civilization and stories carefully carved into stone, says Thuraya, who was trained to interpret rock art. Lahiyanites and Dadanites, she said, were advanced kingdoms that you could put in the same sentence as ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. The Dadanites controlled the lucrative trade of incense, namely frankincense, which was cultivated in Yemen and carried on camel caravans through Dadan en route to temples in Pharaonic Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Levant, where this fragrant tree resin played an important role in religious ceremonies. Centuries before the Nabateans rose up from Petra in modern Jordan as the dominant ancient Arab power, the Dadanites used the incense trade to transform this sleepy, palm-dotted oasis into a regional economic powerhouse. Incense was the petrol of the times. This is why Dadan flourished, said Abdulrahman al-Suhanabi, an associate professor at King Saud University in Riyadh, who has been leading excavations at Dadan for the past decade. What has been excavated speaks to their advancement. One temple features perfectly square tombs and intricate lion statues carved into the rock face. At another, wells and an 8-foot-tall stone basin believed to have been used for ablution by pilgrims coming to give tribute to a pantheon of gods suggests an advanced water management system. In the 5th century BC, another tribe built upon Dadan to create Liyan, an empire extending west into the Gulf of Aqaba and Sinai, and north towards the Levant. What has been uncovered speaks to the Liyanites' influence. 2 imposing, larger-than-life statues of Liyan kings, standing like half-robed pharaohs, were recovered at a Liyanite temple and have since been on tour in Paris. More than 3,000 smaller statues were found inside the Temple of the Lions in 6 weeks of excavation alone. Local residents say they have seen dozens of statues and human-shaped stone idols over the years while picnicking in the valleys. This is likely because Lian's economic juggernaut was built not only on incense trade, but on tribute paid at its temples. It also was a hub for dried dates, which have grown in abundance here for nearly 3,000 years and travel well on weeks-long desert treks. Today, the same oasis counts for 1/3 of Saudi Arabia's date production and is renowned across the country. Stop by and shop or home, and an Al Ula resident will eagerly offer you a platter of the sugary sweet halwa and burni dates that once powered this ancient kingdom. Such was Lian's fame. Ancient Greek cartographer and Pliny the Elder referred to the Gulf of Aqaba as the Gulf of Lian, a name that was in use for 3 centuries. But then, shortly before the 1st century BC, the rival Natabeans from southern Jordan inhabited Lian and transformed it into the town of Al-Hajar, or Hegra, the second city of their empire. Within years, all mention of Lian suddenly stopped. A few miles to the north, the Nabateans built Madain Saleh, majestic tombs carved into rock mounds that rival Petra. With such rich and diverse history, archaeologists are now calling Al Ula an undiscovered country. But that's only because for so long this site was overlooked by Orientalists chasing biblical and Hellenistic lore and shunned by Saudi governments who saw the remains as the un-Islamic relics of pagans. Only since 2017 has the Saudi leadership devoted a vast amount of resources for the archaeological investigation and preservation of Al Ula, in the process of informing its citizens of these lost civilizations. Newfound pride in history. Mohammed Abdullah, a 22-year-old university student from Jeddah, hoists up his phone as he walks between the hundreds of inscriptions and drawings carved into the gorge of Jabal Ikma, live streaming his visit. We saw photos of a rock tomb in a history book, but we thought these were accursed people that had nothing to do with us, says Mr. Abdullah. We never thought that these people were Arabs and could be our ancestors. This is something to really be proud of. The Royal Commission for Al Ula, along with French, German, and British teams and colleagues from King Saudi University, will expand excavations and are set to undertake specialized studies to learn more how these ancient people lived, cultivated, and traded here over the millennia. Already, excavations have unearthed almost as many questions as statues. Are the Datanites and the Lianites the same people? What happened to the Lianites? Why are they not mentioned once in the hundreds of Nabatean inscriptions in Al Ula or elsewhere? But for many, the most important question has been answered. What's so special about ancient Saudi Arabia? We have civilizations on the Arabian Peninsula that are no less than the ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt, says Mr. Al-Shobani, the archaeologist. We should be proud of our history, and we are on our way to let people know about it. Well, let's go on. This next article, Can Roadsides Offer a Beeline for Pollinators? By Jules Struck. Lincoln, Massachusetts. It's early morning in Meridian, Connecticut, and a foraging bee is making its way from flower to flower, stopping here for a sip of nectar, there for a nibble of pollen. It floats into a patch of flowers, unperturbed by the waves of tailwind from passing vehicles. Here at exit 67, off the Wilbur Cross Highway, there is plenty to snack on. The small patch of wild growth is here by design, specifically Adam Boone's design. He's a transportation landscape designer at Connecticut's Department of Transportation, and he's watched this swath of highway side grow into a verdant pollinator habitat. I'm encouraged, he said, of the wildflowers popping up after a few seasons of cutting back on mowing. You just have to see what comes up. Mr. Boone is part of a national network of government agencies, highway divisions, and conservation groups working to set aside public land on the sides of highways as habitat for declining pollinators. In practice, that largely means reduce mowing. Such programs mark a shift towards maintaining highways with an eye on wildlife conservation. You drive along the roadside at 60 miles per hour and see splashes of color, and you recognize that there are probably flowers out there, says Jennifer Hopwood, senior pollinator conservation expert for the Xerces Society of Invertebrate Conservation. Say that again. An environmental nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon. We have to be really creative about finding ways to support pollinators where we live, where we work, where we travel. So, roadsides are a piece of that puzzle. That jigsaw is taking shape along Connecticut's highways a few years after the state's DOT started setting aside roadside spots for pollinator habitat. It's a developing program without so much as an official name, Mr. Boone says, and a whole different strategy from the norm of frequent mowing. It works like this. Mr. Boone or local officials identify roadsides that could grow wild without turning into a fire hazard or obstructing drainage, driver's sight line, or access to roadside structures. Then, Mr. Boone surveys the existing plant life. There may be some nice things already in there, he says, listing some options over the phone. Black-eyed Susan, big bluestem, and goldenrod are good signs. In that case, let's just leave it alone, he says. Otherwise, he'll plant seeds and wait for the blooms. Roadside attraction. Ms. Hopwood is also no stranger to tramping around roadside habitats. She spent a summer in the early 2000s counting bees on Kansas's sprawling prairie roadsides for research. What was then a nascent field of study has since been endorsed by the Federal Highway Administration and bolstered by former President Barack Obama's 2015 Monarch Butterfly Corridor Plan. Today, at least 33 states have integrated pollinator habitats onto their roadsides, according to the Federal Highway Administration's website. But that kind of individual initiative has a flip side, says Evan Abramson, pollination systems designer and planner at Landscape Interactions. His company, based in Northampton, Massachusetts, designs ecological landscapes. Seeing lots of bees on the landscape or seeing lots of pollinators doesn't necessarily mean that it's pollinator friendly, because the insects all might be just one or two species, he says. Basically, not all pollinators are in trouble, echoes Robert Giger, a conservation biologist, assistant professor of biology at University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and scientific consultant at Landscape Interactions. Dr. Giger is wading through wildflowers at Browning Fields Conservation Land in Lincoln, Massachusetts. He points out a common eastern bumblebee in a clump of red clover. This bee species isn't in trouble, he says, unlike the half-black bumblebee buzzing nearby. A more comprehensive approach. But making a truly biodiverse pollinator habitat requires lots of site-specific research and planning, not to mention time. Dr. Giger comes to the Browning Field Conservation Site every week. The good thing is that information can be shared within habitat regions, says Mr. Abramson. Information sharing is a big hurdle, says Heather McCargo, founder and executive director of the Wild Seed Project, a nonprofit in Portland, Maine that promotes native plants. Ms. McCargo wrote a 176-page field guide of plant species and their preferred mowing practices with the Maine DOT in 2018. She hoped it would become a resource for highway maintenance workers. They should not assume every plant they see is bad or needs to be mowed, she said, pointing to plant identification apps as another easy resource. It's just mowing has become the default. Interest is growing, Ms. McCargo says, though the process is really slow. But at Mr. Boone's highway plots, things are progressing nicely. The reduced mowing alone is having a great impact, he said. Next year, at one site, Mr. Boone is planning to transplant existing wildflowers in hopes of propagating over a bald spot. A doable strategy for other DOTs. Just start with what you can manage. As cars and bicyclists whiz by the conservation land in Lincoln, beetles march purposefully through the undergrowth, their armored backs to a blazing sun. Dr. Giger shoulders his butterfly net and peers at a bee in the flowers. We need to target the ones that are in trouble, he says. We need to have a more comprehensive approach. A vote for the word suffragist, not suffragette. I believe we're in a new article. In 2019, Democratic Congresswoman wore white to the State of the Union address to honor the women who had fought for the right to vote and to highlight the progress that still needs to be made towards legal equality. Early 20th century campaigners would often dress in white, a traditional symbol of female purity, to call attention to their cause. In this online age, the Congresswomen used the hashtag suffragette white. It is ironic that suffragette has become such a widely used term, since most of the women who campaigned for suffrage preferred the gender-neutral suffragist. Suffragette was coined in 1906 by a male journalist in order to mock the militant members of the Women's Social and Political Union, or the WSPU, in Britain, who went on hunger strikes and chained themselves to railings. As a demanding term, suffragette was effective. The diminutive suffix "ette" implies small, kitchenette, invitation, leatherette, and cute. Imagine the Radio City's Rockettes instead of the Rockettes. Imagine the Radio City Rockets instead of the Rockettes. The women of the WSPU turned the word into a rallying cry, however. They referred to themselves proudly as suffragettes and renamed their newspaper the Suffragette. Most American campaigners, leery of what some regard as WSPU's aggressive methods, preferred suffragist. The "-ette" suffix did not die out when women finally won the right to vote. Instead, its use multiplied as they joined the workforce in larger numbers. When Congress created the Navy Women's Reserve during World War II, newspapers reported it as Roosevelt's sign, Sailorette Bill, from the Topeka Capitol, July 31st, 1942. In the same year, a magazine noted that Chicago had hired female police officers, titled "Chicago Tries Copettes." Today, "-ette" is no longer a productive suffix according to the Oxford Online Dictionary, except when used in a deliberately flippant or humorous way. Some female supporters of President Donald Trump call themselves Trumpettes, for example. The synonymous suffix "ess" is falling out of use as well. Movie stars and actors today, regardless of gender, waiters and waitresses, have both become servers. Stewards and stewardesses are flight attendants. While "s" is less openly belittling than "ette," it serves the same pernicious function. It implies that the default person in the role is male and a woman is noteworthy and less qualified. Today, we refer to people engaged in a cause as activists, whatever their gender. The use of gender diminutives is dying out, thanks to the protest movement set in motion by the suffragists. Moving on, points of progress where women are seeing gain globally. Number 1, in Canada. The U.S.-based National Women's Hockey League announced the opening of a franchise in Toronto, offering hope that women's sports will not be abandoned during the pandemic. In the middle of national shutdowns, the NWHL has established a new team named the Toronto Six after the Canadian city's nickname. It is the first time the league, formed in 2015, and the first to pay women a salary for playing hockey, will have a presence beyond the U.S. The move is not without critics, but coming a year after the demise of the Canadian Women's Hockey League for lack of financing, it will mark a major advance for women in sports when the season opens in late fall. Number 2, United States. The U.S. Army Special Forces has welcomed its first female Green Beret, a major milestone for one of the last all-male branches of the Army. Green Berets are considered experts in unconventional warfare and counterterrorism. It's against Army Special Operations Command policy to release the names of newly minted soldiers due to unique mission assigned upon graduation. But the female graduate of Special Forces training has captured media attention. A former military intelligence officer, Kathleen Wilder, completed the Army's Special Forces qualification course back in 1980, but was not allowed to graduate at the time. She filed a sex discrimination complaint and was later sent a graduation certificate. At the July 9th graduation ceremony, Lieutenant General Fran Baudet encouraged the new class of Green Beret men and women to smash through stereotypes, innovate, and achieve the impossible. This was from the Army Times by Lindsay McGinnis. Number 3, Latin America. Latin America is on pace to close its gender gap in 59 years, a huge jump from the 74 years expected in 2018. This puts the region just behind Western Europe, which is expected to close gender disparities in the workforce, education, access to health, and political empowerment in 54 years. The World Economic Forum, which issues the annual Global Gender Gap Index, says the sudden advance was due to regional improvements, particularly in political empowerment. Mexico, for example, leaped up the rankings this year after nearly tripling the number of women serving in ministerial positions from 15.8% to 42.1%. With local and federal elections slated this year in nations from Chile to Brazil, the region could slash several more years off of its journey toward gender equality. And this was by Whitney Ulick, special correspondent. In the Middle East, Arab women are serving as government ministers in record numbers. With women serving in 9 of 33 ministerial posts, the United Arab Emirates has the highest ratio of female cabinet members in the Gulf. In December, Kuwait named a record 3 women as ministers. Saudi Arabia recently appointed women as Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Development and Deputy Director General for Alimony Affairs, a first for each role. And 25% of Jordan's latest cabinet are women. Arab women are not only being better represented in government, but are also rising to significant posts. In January, Lebanese politician Zina Akar Adra became the Arab world's first female defense minister and now helms the country's national security efforts and armed forces. By Taylor Lux, special correspondent. In Nigeria, Nigerian leaders pledge a state of emergency over rape and gender-based violence after Nigerian women took to the street en masse in early June to protest a series of high-profile rapes and murders of young women. The country's government did something surprising. It listened. In mid-June, Nigeria's 36 state governors each promised to declare a state of emergency over violence against women and pledged to start the country's first sex offender registry. While it remains to be seen if they will all come through, activists say they have never before seen this kind of momentum against gender-based violence. This is a generation that says enough is enough. Chioma Aguiubu, one of the protest's organizers, told Quartz Africa. This is by Ryan Lenora Brown, staff writer. Number 6, South Korea. South Korean women are mobilizing around gender rights as never before, making significant gains. The latest advance came during April elections when more women, 57, were elected to parliament than at any other time since the country democratized in 1987. The ruling Democratic Party enjoyed a landslide victory and now has 30 female legislators. The new Women's Party, the country's first feminist party, won 200,000 votes, but no seats. South Korea ranks 117th in the world for women's political representation, but the country's momentum on gender issues is unmistakable as women's gains in education raise pressure for greater equality in the workplace and at home, and younger women help energize a #MeToo movement. That was by Ann Scott Tyson, staff writer. Well, I've kind of run over my 30 minutes. This is Pam saying thank you for being with us. This completes the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, August 7th. And now, have a great day and be blessed.